You think you know me? Hear this.
The morning air was cold, and the streets were already busy when the young man stepped out of the small apartment building. People hurried past him without paying attention. Some were heading to work, some were taking their children to school, and others were simply trying to get through another day. He pulled his old jacket closer to his body and started walking. The jacket had been repaired many times. The sleeves were slightly torn, and the fabric had faded long ago. His shoes were not much better, but he had learned not to think too much about such things. There were more important things to worry about. The apartment he lived in was small and old. The paint on the walls was peeling, and the heating system worked only when it wanted to. Yet it was home. More importantly, it was where his grandmother lived. She had raised him since he was very young. Life had never been easy for either of them. Money was always short. Every month seemed to bring a new problem. Sometimes it was the rent. Sometimes it was a broken appliance. Sometimes it was medical bills. Still, his grandmother always found a way to smile. That morning, before he left, she had handed him a small paper bag with a sandwich inside. "You need to eat," she had said. He smiled. "And you need to stop worrying about me." "I'll stop worrying when you stop skipping meals." They both laughed. Moments like those made the difficult days easier. As he walked through the city, he headed toward a small grocery store where he worked part-time. The pay was not great, but it helped keep food on the table. The store owner liked him because he never complained and always worked hard. For several hours he stocked shelves, carried boxes, cleaned floors, and helped customers. Most people barely noticed him. To them, he was just another worker. But there was something almost nobody knew about him. Every free moment he had was devoted to music. More specifically, the piano. Ever since he was a child, music had fascinated him. When he was younger, he would stop and listen whenever he heard someone playing an instrument. He could stand outside a building for 10 minutes just listening to a melody floating through an open window. There was something about piano music that felt different. It spoke without words. It could express sadness, hope, joy, and memories all at once. Years ago, he had discovered an old piano at a community center. The instrument was far from perfect. Several keys were scratched. Some notes sounded slightly different than they should have. The pedals often squeaked. Most people ignored it, but to him it was beautiful. At first, he simply pressed random keys. Then he started teaching himself. He watched musicians whenever he could. He borrowed music books. He practiced endlessly. Mistakes became lessons. Lessons became progress. Progress slowly became skill. Over the years, that old piano became his closest companion. When life felt difficult, he played. When he felt discouraged, he played. When he felt hopeful, he played. Music helped him carry burdens that seemed too heavy. After finishing his shift at the grocery store, he headed directly to the community center. The staff knew him well by now. Some days he practiced for 1 hour. Other days he practiced until the building was ready to close. As he entered the music room that afternoon, he smiled. The old piano was waiting in its usual corner. The room was empty, just the way he liked it. He sat down and placed his fingers gently on the keys. For a moment he closed his eyes. The noise of the city disappeared. The worries about money disappeared. The stress disappeared. Only the music remained. Soft notes filled the room. The melody started slowly before growing stronger. His fingers moved across the keyboard with confidence built through years of practice. He wasn't thinking about impressing anyone. He wasn't imagining fame. He simply loved music. That was enough. An hour passed. Then another. Eventually, one of the community center workers peeked inside. The worker smiled. "You're still here." He laughed. "I lost track of time again." "You always do." The worker leaned against the doorway. "You know, every time I hear you play, I wonder why you're not performing somewhere bigger." He shrugged. "People like me don't get opportunities like that." "Why not?" He looked down at the piano. "I don't know. Maybe that's just how life works." The worker shook his head. "No. Sometimes people just don't realize what they're capable of." The words stayed in his mind long after he left. That evening he returned home. His grandmother was sitting near the window reading a book. She immediately noticed the thoughtful look on his face. What happened? Nothing. That means something happened. He laughed. She knew him too well. After dinner, he told her about the conversation at the community center. She listened carefully. When he finished speaking, she nodded. The worker is right. You think so? I know so. He smiled but didn't respond. His grandmother pointed toward him. You've spent years practicing. That doesn't mean anything. It means everything. Lots of people play piano. Not like you. He looked away. Praise always made him uncomfortable. His grandmother continued. You work hard every day. You help others. You never give up. One day those things will matter. He wanted to believe her, but life had taught him to be realistic. Dreams often belong to people with money, connections, and opportunities. He had none of those things. The next morning followed the same routine. Work, customers, heavy boxes, long hours, nothing unusual, until he noticed a poster hanging on a wall near a bus stop. He almost walked past it. Then something caught his eye. The poster advertised a piano competition. The event would take place at the city's famous opera house. Musicians from different areas would compete for a scholarship and professional training opportunities. He stopped reading and stared at the poster. His heart started beating faster. The opera house was legendary. He had never even been inside. People from all over the city attended performances there. Many famous musicians had performed on its stage. The idea of standing there felt impossible. He looked at the registration deadline. There was still time. For a moment, excitement filled him. Then doubt quickly followed. People entering that competition would likely have professional training. Many would own expensive instruments. Some probably came from wealthy families. What chance did he have? He sighed and continued walking. Yet throughout the day, he couldn't stop thinking about the poster. The image remained in his mind while he worked. It remained there while he ate lunch. It remained there while he practiced piano later that evening. Finally, after returning home, he mentioned it to his grandmother. Her eyes immediately brightened. A piano competition? He nodded. At the opera house. That sounds wonderful. It sounds impossible. Why? He laughed softly. Have you seen me? Yes. You know what I mean. She did. His clothes were old. His life was difficult. Nothing about him looked like a future concert pianist. His grandmother leaned forward. Listen carefully. He looked at her. People may see old clothes. She paused. But music doesn't care about clothes. He remained silent. Music doesn't care about money either. She smiled warmly. It only cares about the person playing it. The room grew quiet. Her words settled deep inside him. For years he had dreamed quietly, never expecting much, never wanting to be disappointed. But now an opportunity stood in front of him. Small perhaps, uncertain certainly, but real. That night he lay awake staring at the ceiling. Questions filled his mind. What if he failed? What if people laughed? What if he embarrassed himself? Yet another question slowly appeared. What if he didn't try? That question felt heavier than all the others. The next morning, before doubt could stop him, he walked to the registration office. His hands felt nervous. His stomach tightened. Several times he considered turning around. But he kept walking. When he finally reached the desk, the woman working there smiled politely. How can I help you? He took a deep breath. For a second, he almost changed his mind. Then he remembered his grandmother's words. Music doesn't care about clothes. He straightened his shoulders. I'd like to register for the piano competition. The woman handed him the paperwork. As he filled out the forms, excitement and fear mixed together inside him. His life had not changed yet. Nothing was guaranteed. But for the first time in a long while, he felt as though a door had opened. And he had just decided to walk through it. The days leading up to the competition passed faster than expected. After registering, he threw himself into practice with even more determination. Every spare moment was spent at the community center. He played scales, repeated difficult passages, and worked on every detail of the piece he planned to perform. Sometimes he stayed so focused that he forgot what time it was. The old piano had become even more familiar to him. Every key, every scratch, every small imperfection. He knew them all. The closer the competition came, however, the harder it became to ignore his nerves. At night, he often lay awake thinking about the opera house. He imagined the large stage, the bright lights, the audience, the judges. Then he imagined making a mistake. That thought always made his stomach tighten. A few days before the event, his grandmother noticed he seemed quieter than usual. During dinner, she looked at him carefully. "You've been thinking too much." He smiled weakly. "Maybe. Not maybe. Definitely." He laughed. She always knew. "What if I'm not good enough?" he finally asked. His grandmother put down her fork. "Do you remember when you first touched a piano?" "Of course. You could barely play a simple tune." He nodded. "You kept practicing anyway. It took years." "Exactly." She pointed toward him. "You didn't become who you are overnight." He looked down. "You already earned your place there. But everyone else will probably be better." His grandmother smiled. "Maybe some will be. Maybe some won't." She paused. "But none of them can play exactly like you." Those words stayed with him. The night before the competition, he barely slept. He kept checking the clock. Every hour felt longer than normal. When morning finally arrived, he got out of bed before sunrise. The city outside was still quiet. He stood near the window and watched the sky slowly brighten. Today was the day. The competition he had dreamed about for weeks had finally arrived. He got dressed carefully. There wasn't much choice in his wardrobe. His best shirt had been washed and ironed as neatly as possible. His jacket was old but clean. His shoes showed signs of wear despite his efforts to polish them. He looked at himself in the mirror. Nothing about him looked like a professional musician. For a moment doubt returned. Then his grandmother appeared behind him. "You look wonderful." He laughed. "I think we're looking at different mirrors." "No," she smiled. "We're looking at different things." Before leaving, she adjusted his collar. "You belong there." Those 3 words gave him more confidence than she probably realized. The trip to the opera house felt longer than usual. As the bus moved through the city, he stared out the window. His thoughts raced endlessly. The closer he got, the more nervous he became. Finally, the bus stopped. He stepped off and looked up. The opera house stood proudly before him. The building was even more impressive than he had imagined. Large stone columns framed the entrance. Tall windows reflected the morning sunlight. People moved in and out carrying instrument cases and garment bags. Everything looked elegant, sophisticated, professional. For a brief moment he considered turning around. What was he doing here? Then he remembered all the years of practice, all the sacrifices, all the long hours. He took a deep breath and walked toward the entrance. Inside, the lobby looked magnificent. Beautiful chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Marble floors stretched in every direction. The walls displayed photographs of famous performers from past years. He felt completely out of place. Around him stood talented musicians preparing for the competition. Many wore expensive suits. Others wore elegant dresses. Some carried themselves with the confidence of people who had spent years performing on important stages. Several contestants chatted comfortably with one another. Some discussed music schools. Others talked about private instructors. A few mentioned international competitions they had entered. Listening to them made him feel smaller and smaller. His own experience felt insignificant by comparison. He quietly moved toward a registration table. A staff member checked his name and handed him a participant badge. Afterward, he found an empty chair in the waiting area. He hoped to avoid attention. Unfortunately, attention found him anyway. A group of contestants nearby noticed him. One glanced toward his worn jacket. Another looked at his shoes. Their expressions quickly changed. He could tell exactly what they were thinking. One whispered something. The others laughed. Not loudly, but loud enough. He tried to ignore it. For a while he succeeded. Then another participant walked past and gave him a curious look. "Are you competing today?" The question sounded harmless. Still, something about the tone felt strange. "Yes," he replied. The person looked surprised. "Oh," that single word said everything. The person moved on. A few minutes later, he heard more whispering. Several contestants kept glancing in his direction. One shook his head. Another smiled as though something was amusing. He stared at the floor. Embarrassment slowly crept into his chest. He suddenly became very aware of every tear in his jacket, every mark on his shoes, every sign of struggle that his clothes revealed. For the first time that morning, he wished he had something better to wear. The waiting area continued filling with competitors. The atmosphere grew more intense. People reviewed sheet music. Others stretched their fingers. Some quietly rehearsed difficult passages. He tried doing the same, but concentrating became difficult. The laughter and whispers had already planted seeds of doubt. Maybe he really didn't belong here. Maybe he had been foolish to enter. As those thoughts grew stronger, he reached into his pocket. Inside was a folded piece of paper. His grandmother had slipped it into his hand before he left. He unfolded it carefully. Written in simple handwriting were just a few words. "Trust the music. Trust yourself." He read the message several times. Slowly his breathing settled. The anxiety didn't disappear completely, but it became manageable. Hours passed. Contestants were called one by one. Some returned looking happy. Others appeared disappointed. Everyone seemed to be carrying their own private battle. That realization helped him. Maybe he wasn't the only nervous person in the building. Maybe everyone was afraid of something. Around midday, contestants were invited into the main auditorium. The moment he entered, he almost forgot to breathe. The room was breathtaking. Rows of seats stretched across the hall. Massive balconies overlooked the stage. Golden details decorated the walls. Above everything hung a magnificent chandelier. At the center stood the grand piano. The instrument seemed almost majestic beneath the stage lights. For years he had practiced on an aging piano with scratched keys. Now he was looking at one of the finest instruments he had ever seen. His heart raced. Nearby, audience members slowly filled seats. Family members, music lovers, and guests settled into place. Judges sat at a long table facing the stage. Their expressions appeared calm and professional. He recognized some of their names from articles and interviews he had read. Their experience alone was intimidating. As contestants waited for their turns, conversations continued around him. Some people discussed technique. Others compared performances. A few still looked in his direction with curiosity. One contestant sitting nearby quietly asked another, "Do you think he's actually competing?" The second person shrugged. Both laughed softly. He pretended not to hear, but he heard every word. The comments hurt more than he wanted to admit. Not because they were cruel, because they confirmed his biggest fear. People judged him before hearing a single note. They had already made their decision, and all they had seen was his appearance. The competition continued. One performer after another stepped onto the stage. Some received strong applause. Others received polite appreciation. As time passed, his turn grew closer. His hands became cold. His mouth felt dry. He kept looking toward the piano. Soon he would be sitting there. Soon there would be no place to hide. A staff member eventually approached. "Please be ready. You're coming up next." His heart nearly stopped. Next. The word echoed inside his head. Around him, the noise seemed to fade. The audience, the contestants, the whispers, everything blurred together. Only the stage remained. He stood slowly. His legs felt heavier than usual. The staff member gave him an encouraging smile. "Good luck." He nodded. For a brief second, fear tried one final time to take control. Then he remembered the community center, the old piano, the years of practice, his grandmother's faith in him, the note in his pocket. "Trust the music. Trust yourself." He took a deep breath. The announcer stepped forward. His name was called. The audience turned toward the stage entrance. Every eye seemed focused on him. As he began walking forward, a few people noticed his worn clothing and exchanged surprised looks. A faint ripple of whispering spread through parts of the audience. He heard some of it, ignored the rest. This was no longer about clothes, no longer about appearances, no longer about what others thought. The stage was only a few steps away now. The grand piano waited beneath the bright lights. And for the first time that day, he felt something stronger than fear. He felt ready. He walked onto the stage and toward the piano as the entire opera house watched in silence. The moment he stepped onto the stage, the enormous opera house seemed even larger than before. Bright lights shined down from above. Rows and rows of seats stretched out in front of him. Hundreds of faces looked in his direction. Some appeared curious. Some looked supportive. Others seemed doubtful. He could still hear a few whispers moving through the audience. People noticed his old jacket. They noticed his worn shoes. Some seemed surprised that someone dressed like him was standing on such an important stage. For a brief moment, the pressure felt overwhelming. His heart beat faster. His palms felt damp. Every step toward the piano seemed heavier than the last. But he kept moving. He reached the piano bench and slowly sat down. The grand piano looked beautiful up close. The polished surface reflected the stage lights. The keys seemed almost untouched. For years he had practiced on an old instrument with chipped paint and squeaky pedals. Now he was sitting in front of one of the finest pianos he had ever seen. The difference was almost unbelievable. The audience grew quieter. The judges waited patiently. The entire room seemed to be holding its breath. He placed his hands gently above the keys. Then he stopped. Just for a second. Fear suddenly returned. A dangerous thought entered his mind. What if everyone was right? What if he truly didn't belong here? What if he embarrassed himself in front of all these people? His fingers trembled slightly. He looked down at the keyboard. Then something unexpected happened. He remembered the community center. He remembered the small practice room, the old piano, the cracked walls, the countless evenings spent alone with music. He remembered practicing after long work shifts. He remembered carrying heavy boxes all day and still finding energy to play. He remembered his grandmother waiting up for him at night. He remembered her smile. He remembered the note she had placed in his pocket. Trust the music. Trust yourself. Slowly, his breathing became steady. The fear did not disappear completely, but it no longer controlled him. He closed his eyes for a brief moment. Then he began. The first notes were soft, gentle, simple. The melody floated through the opera house like a quiet conversation. At first, some audience members seemed unsure what to expect. A few shifted in their seats. Others continued watching cautiously. The piece started slowly, almost as if it were telling a story one small chapter at a time. He focused only on the music. Nothing else mattered. Not the audience. Not the judges. Not the whispers. Only the piano. Only the next note. And then the next. His hands moved naturally across the keys. Years of practice began taking over. The nervousness that had followed him all day slowly started fading away. The music became stronger, richer, more expressive. The melody grew with confidence. People in the audience started paying closer attention. The whispering stopped. One by one, conversations disappeared. Soon the hall became completely silent. Not because the audience was bored, because they were listening, really listening. A woman sitting near the front leaned forward slightly. An older man folded his hands and focused on the stage. Even several contestants waiting backstage peeked through the curtains. Something was changing. The judges noticed it too. One of them stopped writing notes and looked up. Another adjusted her glasses and listened more carefully. The performance was beginning to capture the room. As the music continued, memories seemed to flow through every note. He wasn't just playing a song. He was telling his story. Without words. The difficult years. The struggles. The sacrifices. The hopes he never spoke about. Everything found its way into the music. The audience couldn't know every detail of his life. But they could feel the emotion. And emotion has a way of reaching people. A young girl sitting beside her father stared at the stage without blinking. Several audience members exchanged surprised glances. The same people who had judged him moments earlier now seemed confused. This wasn't the performance they expected. Not even close. The music continued building. The melody became more powerful. His fingers moved faster. The grand piano responded beautifully. Every note sounded clear. Every phrase carried meaning. The confidence he had searched for all morning was finally there. For the first time that day, he forgot where he was. He forgot about the competition. He forgot about winning. He forgot about losing. The opera house disappeared. Only the music remained. Backstage, contestants listened quietly. Many had arrived expecting to compete against skilled musicians. Few had expected this. One participant shook his head in disbelief. Another simply stared. No one was laughing anymore. No one was whispering. The performance demanded attention. And attention was exactly what it received. The music shifted again. The softer sections returned briefly. This time they carried even greater emotion. The notes seemed to speak directly to the audience. Some listeners smiled gently. Others appeared thoughtful. A few looked surprisingly emotional. It was remarkable how a simple melody could affect so many people. But great music often does exactly that. Connects strangers through feelings they all understand. Hope, fear, joy, determination, loss, dreams. Every person in the room heard something different. Yet somehow everyone shared the same experience. The judges exchanged another glance. Years of experience had taught them how to recognize technical skill. But technical skill alone rarely moved an audience. This performance offered something more. Felt genuine, honest, human. That quality could not be taught easily. As the piece entered its next section, his confidence continued growing. His hands no longer trembled. His posture relaxed. The uncertainty that had followed him onto the stage was gone. He belonged here. For years he had doubted it. Now the music itself seemed to answer that question. Yes, he belonged. The audience could feel it too. A man seated near the middle rows remembered seeing him enter earlier. He remembered noticing the worn jacket, the old shoes, the modest appearance. At the time he had made assumptions. Now he felt embarrassed by them. The music was reminding everyone of something important. Talent doesn't always arrive wearing expensive clothes. Dreams don't belong only to the wealthy. And greatness often appears where people least expect it. The performance continued, drawing listeners deeper into the story. Even people who knew little about piano found themselves captivated. They didn't need musical training to understand what they were hearing. They simply needed ears and an open heart. Several minutes passed. The hall remained completely silent except for the music. No phones. No conversations. No distractions. Only the piano. Only the performer. Only the story unfolding through every note. The atmosphere inside the opera house felt different now. Warmer. More connected. More emotional. The audience had stopped seeing his clothes. They had stopped noticing his appearance. Now they saw only the musician. And the musician was extraordinary. As another powerful section filled the hall, applause almost started prematurely from one corner of the audience. Someone quickly stopped themselves. Nobody wanted to interrupt. The performance deserved to reach its conclusion. The judges leaned forward. Their attention never left the stage. Every note seemed to strengthen their impression. Every phrase revealed another layer of ability. The contestant many people had doubted was now becoming impossible to ignore. Backstage, several competitors sat quietly. Some looked inspired. Others looked nervous. A few wondered whether they could match what they had just heard. Regardless of the competition's final outcome, one thing had become clear. This performance would be remembered. The music began approaching its final section. The energy increased. The emotional intensity grew stronger. His fingers moved confidently across the keyboard. Years of dedication were finally being revealed. Not through words. Not through explanations. Through music. The audience could sense the climax approaching. Every person seemed fully invested. Every eye remained fixed on the stage. The opera house that had once felt intimidating now felt strangely welcoming. The stage no longer felt like enemy territory, felt like home. For perhaps the first time in his life, he was showing the world exactly who he was. Not through appearance, not through status, not through wealth, through talent, through effort, through passion. And the world was finally listening. As the final section began, the emotion inside the hall became almost tangible. The audience sat completely still. The judges watched carefully. The contestants listened quietly. The music was building toward something unforgettable. And as his hands moved across the piano with growing power and confidence, everyone in the opera house realized they were witnessing something far beyond an ordinary competition performance. They were witnessing a moment that would be talked about long after the final note was played. The music continued flowing through the opera house, growing stronger with every passing second. By now, nobody was paying attention to the old jacket. Nobody was noticing the worn shoes. Nobody cared where he came from. The only thing that mattered was the music. Every note seemed to pull the audience deeper into the performance. People sat completely still. The atmosphere inside the hall felt different from earlier. The room that had once been filled with doubt now felt filled with anticipation. Everyone wanted to hear what would happen next. As he continued playing, he felt more connected to the piano than ever before. His hands moved naturally. There was no fear anymore. No nervousness. No uncertainty. Only focus. Only music. Years of practice were finally coming together. Every late night. Every difficult day. Every sacrifice. Everything had led to this moment. The grand piano responded beautifully beneath his fingertips. The rich sound filled every corner of the opera house. Even people sitting in the highest seats felt connected to the performance. The judges remained completely focused. One of them had stopped writing notes several minutes earlier. Another leaned forward slightly, clearly fascinated by what he was hearing. These were experienced professionals. They had listened to countless musicians throughout their careers. Yet even they seemed impressed. The performance carried something rare, something difficult to explain. It wasn't just skill. It wasn't just technique. It was sincerity. The audience could feel that every note meant something. Nothing sounded forced. Nothing felt artificial. The music came directly from the heart. That honesty gave the performance unusual power. As the melody shifted into another emotional section, many listeners found themselves reflecting on their own lives. A businessman sitting near the center remembered struggles from his younger years. An elderly woman thought about dreams she had nearly abandoned decades earlier. A college student thought about challenges she was currently facing. The music connected with everyone differently. Yet somehow it connected with everyone. That was what made it special. Backstage, contestants continued listening quietly. Many had prepared for months. Some had studied under famous teachers. Others had performed in prestigious venues before. Yet all of them recognized the same thing. This performance was memorable. Not because it was perfect, because it felt real. One contestant quietly whispered, "I didn't expect this." Another nodded. Neither had anything else to say. Words felt unnecessary. The music was speaking for itself. Meanwhile, his confidence continued growing. The more he played, the more comfortable he became. It almost felt as though the piano understood him. Every emotion he wanted to express seemed to emerge naturally. The audience followed him through every moment. When the music softened, they listened carefully. When it grew powerful, they felt the energy rise. Nobody wanted the performance to end. Near the front row sat a man who had laughed earlier when he first saw the young musician enter the building. He remembered the assumptions he had made. He remembered thinking there was no way someone dressed like that could compete with the others. Now he felt ashamed. He wasn't alone. Several audience members were experiencing the same realization. They had judged too quickly. They had seen appearance instead of ability. Now the music was teaching them an important lesson. Talent does not announce itself through expensive clothing. Character cannot be measured by appearance. And potential often hides in places people overlook. The performance continued building toward its climax. The energy inside the room grew stronger. Every note seemed more powerful than the last. The audience remained completely silent. Not because they were instructed to, because they were captivated. Even small sounds disappeared. Nobody shuffled in their seats. Nobody checked their phones. Nobody looked away. Their attention belonged entirely to the stage. For him, time seemed to move differently. Minutes felt like seconds. The outside world no longer existed. The grocery store, the small apartment, the community center, the worries about money, everything faded away. Only this moment remained. Only this stage. Only this piano. Only this music. As another beautiful passage filled the hall, he suddenly remembered something his grandmother had once told him years earlier. At the time, he had been frustrated because learning a difficult piece seemed impossible. He had wanted to quit. She had listened patiently before giving simple advice. Don't focus on the whole mountain. Just take the next step. Back then, he hadn't fully understood. Now he did. Every practice session had been a step. Every mistake had been a step. Every challenge had been a step. And somehow those small steps had brought him here. A smile briefly appeared on his face as he continued playing. The audience noticed. So did the judges. That small smile revealed something important. He wasn't merely performing. He was enjoying the moment. He loved music. And that love could be felt throughout the room. The final section of the piece slowly approached. The emotional intensity increased once again. His hands moved confidently across the keyboard. The notes became richer, stronger, more expressive. The grand piano seemed almost alive beneath his touch. Every phrase carried meaning. Every passage told part of the story. The audience sensed that something special was coming. People leaned forward. Several listeners clasped their hands together. Others watched with wide eyes. Nobody wanted to miss a single moment. The judges exchanged another glance. Years of experience allowed them to recognize exceptional performances. This was becoming one of them. Not because it contained flashy tricks. Not because it was overly complicated. Because it connected. Because it communicated. Because it moved people. And moving people is one of the hardest things any performer can do. The final minutes arrived. The music surged forward with renewed strength. His confidence reached its highest point. Everything felt effortless, natural, free. For the first time in his life, he truly believed he belonged on that stage. The doubt that had followed him for years was finally disappearing. Not because someone told him he was talented. Not because someone handed him an opportunity. Because he had proven it to himself. The audience felt the emotional weight of the moment. Some listeners smiled. Others looked deeply thoughtful. A few appeared close to tears. The performance had become more than a competition entry. It had become a story about perseverance, a story about believing in yourself, a story about refusing to quit. Without speaking a single word, he had communicated all of that through music. As the final movement began, the energy inside the opera house reached its peak. The notes filled the hall with remarkable power. Every listener remained completely focused. The judges sat motionless. The contestants backstage listened carefully. Even the staff members standing near the walls appeared captivated. The music continued rising, building, growing. The tension became almost impossible to ignore. Everyone knew the ending was approaching. Nobody knew exactly how it would feel, but everyone sensed it would be memorable. His fingers moved with confidence earned through years of hard work. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only complete commitment to the music. The final sequence arrived. Beautiful notes flowed rapidly across the piano. The sound echoed through the magnificent hall. The audience sat frozen in place, completely absorbed. Then came the final moments, the last emotional passage, the final expression of everything he wanted to say. His heart poured into every note. The audience could feel it. The judges could feel it. Even he could feel it. This was not simply the end of a performance. It was the result of years of dedication. Years of believing in a dream that few others could see. The final notes approached. One by one they filled the hall. Powerful, beautiful, unforgettable. Then came the very last note. It rang through the opera house and slowly faded into silence. The sound lingered for a brief moment, then disappeared completely, and suddenly there was nothing. No music, no applause, no movement, just silence. A deep, powerful silence. The entire opera house remained frozen. Nobody seemed able to react. The audience sat motionless. The judges stared toward the stage. The contestants backstage stood quietly. For several seconds, nobody moved at all. The silence itself became part of the performance. It was the kind of silence that only happens when people have experienced something meaningful. The young musician slowly lowered his hands from the piano. His heart still raced. He looked out toward the audience. Hundreds of faces stared back at him. No one was laughing. No one was whispering. No one was judging his clothes anymore. For one brief moment, the entire opera house seemed united by what they had just witnessed. And then, from somewhere near the front row, a single pair of hands began to clap. The first clap echoed through the opera house. For a brief second, it stood alone. Then another person joined. And another. Within moments, the entire audience erupted into applause. The sound filled every corner of the building. People rose from their seats one after another. Soon almost everyone was standing. The applause grew louder and louder. Some audience members cheered. Others simply continued clapping with genuine admiration. The standing ovation seemed endless. The young musician sat frozen for a moment. He could hardly believe what was happening. Just a short time earlier, many people had looked at him with doubt. Some had whispered. Some had laughed. Now those same people were standing and applauding. The change felt almost unreal. Slowly, he stood from the piano bench. His heart was still racing. He bowed politely toward the audience. The applause only became louder. A few people near the front row even wiped tears from their eyes. The performance had touched them in ways they had not expected. He looked around the hall. Everywhere he turned, people were smiling. For years he had dreamed about playing on a stage like this. He had imagined what it might feel like. But reality was far more powerful than anything he had imagined. Backstage, contestants watched the reaction with amazement. Several applauded along with the audience. Some smiled respectfully. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Regardless of who eventually won the competition, everyone understood that something special had happened. The young musician left the stage as the applause continued behind him. Once he stepped backstage, he finally allowed himself to breathe. His hands were still shaking slightly, not from fear anymore, from emotion. A staff member approached him almost immediately. "That was incredible." He smiled awkwardly. "Thank you." Another staff member offered congratulations. Then another. Soon several people were speaking with him. The attention felt strange. He wasn't used to it. Most days, people barely noticed him. Now everyone seemed eager to talk to him. A few contestants approached as well. One of them extended a hand. "That was one of the best performances I've heard." The young musician thanked him sincerely. Another competitor smiled. "You completely surprised everyone." He laughed softly. "I think I surprised myself too." The group laughed. For the first time all day, nobody seemed concerned about his clothes. Nobody cared where he came from. The focus had shifted entirely to his talent. A short time later, competition organizers invited several participants to a private waiting area. The judges needed time to finish their evaluations. Until then, contestants would wait. As he entered the room, he found a quiet seat near the corner. His mind replayed the performance again and again. Every note, every moment, every emotion. Part of him worried about mistakes he might have made. Another part simply felt grateful. No matter what happened next, he had given everything he had. That realization brought peace. About an hour later, a competition coordinator entered the room. "We would like to speak with a few participants individually." Several names were called. His name was among them. His stomach tightened again. He followed the coordinator down a hallway and into a smaller room. Inside sat 3 judges, the same judges who had watched his performance. They greeted him warmly. "Please have a seat." He sat down carefully. For a moment nobody spoke. Then one of the judges smiled. "We would like to thank you for your performance today." "Thank you." Another judge nodded. "You demonstrated remarkable musical ability." He wasn't sure how to respond. Compliments from professionals felt different than compliments from friends. These people understood music at the highest level. Hearing praise from them carried special meaning. The third judge leaned forward slightly. "There is something we would like to know." He nodded. "Of course. Where did you receive your training?" The question made him smile. "I mostly taught myself." All 3 judges looked surprised. "You taught yourself?" "Mostly." He explained how he had practiced at the community center, how he borrowed books, how he spent years learning through persistence and determination. The judges listened carefully. The more he explained, the more impressed they seemed. One of them finally shook her head. "That makes your performance even more remarkable." The conversation continued for several minutes. They asked about his musical influences, his goals, his future plans. Eventually the discussion became more personal. One judge asked how he balanced work and music. He answered honestly, "It hasn't always been easy." He briefly described working long hours at the grocery store, helping support his grandmother, finding time to practice whenever possible. The room grew quiet. The judges exchanged thoughtful looks. The story behind the performance was becoming clearer. The emotion they had heard in the music suddenly made even more sense. Before leaving, one judge offered a final comment. "Never stop playing." Those simple words meant more to him than she probably realized. When he returned to the waiting area, he felt both nervous and hopeful. The results had not been announced yet. Anything could happen. Still, he felt proud. No matter the outcome, he had earned respect through his performance. Hours later, the competition officially ended. Audience members began leaving the opera house. Many continued discussing the performance they had witnessed. Several conversations centered around the young musician. People shared stories about how deeply the music had affected them. Some described feeling inspired. Others spoke about the lesson they had learned. A local journalist interviewing audience members noticed something interesting. Again and again, people mentioned the same thing. They had judged him too quickly. They had assumed his appearance reflected his abilities. His performance had challenged those assumptions. The journalist became curious. Eventually, she requested a brief interview. At first, he hesitated. Public attention made him uncomfortable. But he agreed. The interview took place in a quiet section of the opera house lobby. The journalist smiled warmly. "You've received an incredible reaction today." He nodded modestly. "I'm very grateful." "What was going through your mind when you walked onto that stage?" He laughed softly. "Honestly, I was terrified." The journalist smiled. "Most people would never guess that." "I nearly turned around several times." They both laughed. The conversation continued naturally. Eventually she asked about his background. He shared parts of his story. Not dramatically, simply honestly. He talked about growing up with very little money. He talked about his grandmother. He talked about the old piano at the community center. He talked about practicing whenever he could. As he spoke, nearby listeners quietly gathered around. Several people recognized him from the performance. They listened carefully. Many seemed moved by the story. The journalist finally asked one last question. "What kept you going during difficult times?" He thought for a moment, then smiled. "My grandmother." The answer came immediately. "She always believed in me." His voice softened slightly. "Even when I didn't believe in myself." The interview ended shortly afterward. Yet the story continued spreading. Several audience members posted about the performance online. Others shared photos and comments. Word traveled quickly. By evening, more people were talking about the young musician. Not because of his appearance, because of his perseverance, because of his talent, because of the message his story carried. Meanwhile, he was heading home. The bus ride felt very different from the one that morning. The city outside looked the same. The streets looked the same. But something inside him had changed. For years he had quietly wondered whether his dream mattered. Whether all those hours of practice meant anything. Today had given him an answer. Yes, they mattered. Every hour. Every sacrifice. Every challenge. When he finally reached his apartment building, the sun was beginning to set. He climbed the stairs and opened the door. His grandmother immediately stood up. Her eyes searched his face. Well, he smiled. That was all it took. She already knew. Tears filled her eyes. She wrapped him in a tight hug. For several seconds neither spoke. Words were unnecessary. Eventually she pulled back. I told you that you belonged there. He laughed. You did. And did you finally believe me? He thought about the applause, the standing ovation, the judges, the audience, the performance. Then he smiled again. For the first time, I think I do. That evening they shared a simple dinner together. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive, yet it felt like a celebration. The competition results would be announced soon. Nobody knew exactly what would happen. But one thing was already certain. The young man who had walked into the opera house wearing worn clothes and carrying years of doubt was no longer the same person. The audience had discovered his talent. The judges had recognized his potential. And perhaps most importantly of all, he had finally begun recognizing it himself. As night settled over the city, neither he nor his grandmother realized that the biggest surprise of all was still waiting just around the corner. The days following the competition felt almost unreal. Life outside his apartment looked exactly the same. The streets were still busy. The grocery store still opened every morning. The buses still followed their usual routes. Yet something had changed. People were beginning to recognize him. At first, it happened only occasionally. Someone would smile while passing him on the street. Another person would say they had attended the competition. A customer at the grocery store even stopped him one afternoon. Weren't you the pianist from the opera house? He looked surprised. The customer smiled. You were amazing. After thanking him, he returned to work. But the moment stayed with him. For years he had gone unnoticed. Now complete strangers were encouraging him. The attention felt strange, but it also felt motivating. A few days later, local newspapers published stories about the competition. Several articles focused on his journey. Journalists were fascinated by the contrast. A young man from a modest background had stepped onto one of the city's most respected stages and delivered a performance people could not stop talking about. The story spread quickly. Music teachers discussed it. Students shared it. Audience members continued posting online about the performance. Many people were inspired by the message behind it. They saw someone who had refused to give up despite difficult circumstances. That message resonated with people far beyond the opera house. Meanwhile, he continued living his normal life. He still practiced at the community center. He still worked part-time. He still helped his grandmother whenever he could. Success had not changed his daily habits. If anything, it made him work even harder. One afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after the competition, an official letter arrived. The envelope carried the logo of the opera house. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. His grandmother watched from across the room. Well, he carefully unfolded the letter. His eyes scanned the page. For a few seconds he said nothing. Then he looked up. His grandmother immediately knew something important had happened. What is it? He smiled. A smile so wide she had not seen it in years. I won. For a moment she simply stared. Then tears filled her eyes. You won. He nodded. The letter officially confirmed it. He had been selected as the competition winner. Along with the title came a scholarship, advanced musical training opportunities, and invitations to perform at future events. For several seconds neither spoke. The news felt too big to process. Then his grandmother hugged him tightly. This time neither of them tried to hide their emotions. Years of struggle. Years of sacrifice. Years of uncertainty. All of it suddenly felt worthwhile. That evening became one of the happiest nights they had ever shared. The apartment was still small. The furniture was still old. Nothing around them had changed. Yet everything felt different. Hope filled the room. The future no longer seemed limited. It seemed open, filled with possibilities. Over the following months, opportunities continued arriving. Music schools reached out. Professional musicians offered guidance. Organizations invited him to perform. For the first time in his life, doors that had always seemed locked were beginning to open. Despite all the excitement, he remained grounded. Whenever someone praised him, he thanked them politely. Whenever people asked about his success, he spoke honestly. He never pretended the journey had been easy, but he also never complained. Instead, he focused on gratitude. Gratitude for music. Gratitude for opportunity. And above all, gratitude for his grandmother. One of the first things he did after receiving financial support was replace the old piano at home. For years he had dreamed about owning a decent instrument. Now that dream was finally possible. The day the piano arrived was unforgettable. Several workers carefully carried it into the apartment. His grandmother stood nearby smiling the entire time. When everything was ready, he sat down at the bench. For a few moments he simply looked at it. The polished wood, the beautiful keys, the smooth pedals, felt unreal. Then he played. The room immediately filled with music. His grandmother listened from her favorite chair near the window. The same chair where she had spent years encouraging him. The same chair where she had reminded him not to give up. As the music filled the apartment, she quietly wiped away a tear. This was a moment neither of them would ever forget. As his career slowly developed, he encountered something unexpected. Young people began reaching out to him. Many shared stories similar to his own. Some came from difficult backgrounds. Others struggled with self-confidence. Many believed their dreams were impossible. They saw themselves in his story. At first, he simply answered messages whenever possible. Then he started visiting community centers. He spoke with students. He shared his experiences. He explained how long the journey had been, how many mistakes he had made, how many times he had doubted himself. The young listeners appreciated his honesty. They didn't need another perfect success story. They needed proof that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things through persistence. And that was exactly what he offered. One afternoon after speaking at a community center, a young boy approached him. The boy looked nervous. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "What if people don't believe in me?" The question instantly reminded him of his younger self. He smiled gently. "Then you believe in yourself until they do." The boy nodded thoughtfully. That conversation stayed with him for days. He realized something important. Winning the competition had changed his life. But inspiring others might become even more meaningful. Months continued passing. His reputation as a musician grew steadily. More performances followed. More opportunities appeared. Yet one invitation stood out above all others. It came from the opera house. The same building where everything had changed. The same stage where people had once doubted him. This time, however, the invitation was different. He was not being invited to compete. He was being invited to perform as a featured guest artist. When he received the invitation, he sat quietly for several minutes. The significance of the moment was impossible to ignore. A year earlier, he had entered that building uncertain and afraid. Now he was being welcomed back as an honored performer. The evening of the concert finally arrived. As he stood backstage, memories flooded his mind. He remembered the whispers, the nervousness, the fear, the uncertainty. He remembered walking toward the piano wondering if he belonged. Now he knew the answer. The stage manager approached. "They're ready for you." He nodded. His heart still beat quickly. Some things never change. Then he stepped onto the stage. The audience immediately began applauding. Not because he had played a note yet, because they already knew his story. Many people in attendance remembered the competition. Others had heard about it. All of them understood the significance of the moment. As he walked toward the piano, he noticed someone sitting near the front row. His grandmother. She smiled proudly. He smiled back. Then he took his seat. The hall grew quiet, just as it had during the competition. But this silence felt different. Back then it had been filled with uncertainty. Now it was filled with anticipation. The audience was eager to listen. He placed his hands above the keys. For a brief moment he reflected on the journey. The small apartment, the grocery store, the community center, the old piano, the doubts, the struggles, the sacrifices. Every chapter had led here. Then he began to play. The music flowed effortlessly. The audience listened carefully. The notes filled the magnificent hall. This time he wasn't trying to prove anything. He wasn't trying to silence critics. He wasn't trying to win a competition. He was simply sharing the gift he loved most: music. As the performance continued, he felt grateful for every challenge he had faced. Without those challenges, he would not have become the person he was. Without those obstacles, he might never have discovered his own strength. The concert ended with a powerful final piece. When the last note faded, the audience rose to its feet. Another standing ovation filled the opera house. The applause seemed endless. He stood and bowed. Then he looked toward his grandmother. She was applauding with everyone else. Proud, happy, emotional. For a moment, their eyes met across the crowded hall. No words were needed. Both understood what this moment meant. The young man who had once been judged by his appearance had earned something far greater than recognition. He had earned respect, not through wealth, not through status, not through luck, through perseverance, through humility, through years of dedication. And as the applause echoed throughout the opera house, one lesson became clear. People may notice your appearance first. They may form opinions before knowing your story. But true character reveals itself over time. And when talent is matched with hard work and determination, it becomes impossible to ignore. The audience continued applauding as he stood beside the piano, smiling with gratitude. The journey that began with doubt had ended with belief. Not only belief from others, belief in himself. And that made all the difference.